All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. This is part two of a four-part series episodes that I am doing that are focused on the training cycle and nutrition inputs that I follow when preparing for an ultramarathon race, which for me is usually going to be peaking for something similar to like a 100-mile distance. So keep that in mind as you think about like the order of operations of how I do these things in the training cycle and the nutrition inputs that I use for them. If you didn't listen to the first one, which was the off season, I do encourage you to go back and listen to that, at least the beginning, because I do kind of highlight some aspects of this training or this podcast episode series that I'm doing that may be helpful in better understanding this episode and the following ones. But for this particular episode, we're going to dive into what I call the base building phase of my training and nutrition when preparing for ultramarathons. All right, so base building is the time of year where I'm kind of looking at two main things anyway. One is I'm trying to get my training back to where I'm hitting some of the volume targets that are more typical in the kind of the meat of my training cycle. So I'm coming off that off season where I may have had like very little inputs on days where I'm not very motivated, where I really feel like I need the rest and recovery. And I'm starting to really add the running related structure back to my training. So I'm sort of pivoting from, all right, the running side of things can be there if I'm feeling motivated about it, but they're not usually structured. And a lot of times I'm pivoting to other things that would be considered maybe cross training, and any real structure that I have in the off season is going to be likely more laying the foundation and the repetition with strength work and mobility and things like that into, all right, this is a phase of the year where the running returns in a structured manner and we're really ready to go and looking to kind of build up and attack whatever the next goal is. So the way I like to describe the beginning of this is it is sort of kind of holds on to a bit of the off season in the sense that I'm not going to get right back to where I was in the middle of a normal training cycle. I'm going to spend some time working back up to it. I believe that this approach, for me anyway, allows me to have a shorter off season because it's more of a gradual reintroduction into the structure of running versus an extended off season. And then from a timeline standpoint or an excitement standpoint, I'm like really wanting to get right back into the middle of things. I like to give myself like usually a training block of like 3 to 4 weeks where I'm kind of spending some time kind of like easing back up to some of those like volume targets that I would maybe typically hit in the middle of a training cycle in the beginning of this. The focus inputs, though, are going to be pretty consistent throughout this phase. I'm going to have one main one that I'm really targeting, and that's what I call my base intensity, which is why it's the base building phase. So for those of you who are not familiar with the way I kind of like term and use this thing, it's basically what I mean by base building is like my heavy focus is going to be on like zone 2 work, or the ceiling at which I'm going to try not to exceed, at least not on a frequent basis, is that aerobic threshold. The way I look at it is like if I want to maximize the amount of volume I'm able to spend at or below my aerobic threshold, I want to make sure I'm not extending beyond that for meaningful amounts of time, because that's likely going to come at the expense of additional base work. And right now, that's my primary objective, is building back up the amount of base work I can tolerate from a volume standpoint, as well as the pace at which I'm able to move at it. So kind of the efficiency within that. So my base building phase is partly doing that structure, adding that stimulus back, and then also monitoring where that is falling relative to where I've gotten the pass, so that I can get a signal of when I'm ready to kind of exit this phase and enter the next phase of training that I'll talk about in the next episode of this series, which is the speed work development phase. So what this usually ends up meaning, just for me at the personal individual level, from a historic standpoint, is I'm usually going to get up to like maybe 10 to 15 hours per week of running during this base intensity phase. Like I said, I'm going to be working my way up towards that. And then once I'm kind of getting up to that where I'm consistently able to hit 10 to 15 hours per week, with a big bulk of that being at that zone 2 base intensity, that's where I'm kind of like, okay, I've got that in place, and now I can start considering kind of what's next. But the other piece of that component too is how fast am I doing those miles? So for example, let's say I work up to that where I'm in between, like say 10 to 15 hours per week at that base intensity, but my pace is noticeably slower than it maybe was historically at that intensity, when things like the course that I'm running or the route that I'm running and the weather and all these things are optimized. If I'm still a ways off from that, if I can help it from a timeline standpoint, I'd like to sit in this base phase longer and wait for that pace to adjust and come back down to where it usually is at its best before I start considering adding in the speed work development phase. Another way to look at this is like most people, myself included, usually have a certain amount of time per week that you can dedicate towards training. So once I've maximized that time at that zone 2 base intensity, it's time to start watching to see if that pace is dropping. If I get to a point where that's sort of plateauing, where it's like I'm sort of just redoing the same thing over and over again and nothing is really changing, that's another kind of signal that it's time for me to move on from that base phase. For some numbers that for those of you who are interested, historically in the past, when like things are like perfectly optimized, where like I'm feeling pretty fresh, weather's perfect for running, the course is like just optimal, so maybe even just like a track. In the past, I've been able to get my base intensity down to like a low 6, and at times I've even peaked just under 6-minute mile pace at this intensity. Like I said, those are optimal conditions. There's no hill climbing in that pace. The weather's not blazing hot or anything like that. So there is a little bit of a balance there in terms of like what time of year it is. Where, for example, let's say when I was living in Phoenix and I was in a base building phase in say like January and February, which is just like perfect running environment. You'd have these like spots where I could get on the canal path where it's just like a straight shot running. It would go underneath the road, so I hardly ever had to stop. Weather was about as perfect as you're gonna ever get for running. Something like that, that's probably a scenario in which I'm maybe going to see that like really faster pace, relatively speaking, at my base intensity, versus where I live here now in Austin, where, even during the winter, there are some days where I could maybe go like 1 for 1 in terms of running quality in terms of the weather here, but it's less consistent. I'm more likely to see like a range of humidity and things like that. The routes I have here in Austin are oftentimes different unless I'm hopping on a track too. So to some degree, it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison. So just kind of knowing that about yourself in terms of like, where are those markers that I want to try to hit based on the routes I'm running and the weather and the climate, where those kind of fall and how they range from like one area that I've lived versus another. And like I said, the weather and things like that are important. So like here in Austin, I'm not going to get down to a spot where I'm consistently running that fast at my base in most cases, just due to the environment and the terrain and things like that I'm doing here. So it is a bit of a moving target, but like I said, a lot of times in those type of those situations where there is a variance there, and if I have a hard time necessarily knowing like for example, like the first year I was here in Austin, I'm learning a lot of this stuff as we go versus like coming in with a prior experience. In that scenario, I'm much more likely to be thinking about it from the lens of, okay, I've got some consistent volume put into these routes. I'm hitting that 10 to 15 hour volume mark, and am I seeing improvement or not? So when I kind of go back and I like break down the data from my runs, am I still seeing over time, so weeks, not days, weeks, am I seeing a reduction in this pace still, or am I seeing a plateauing? If I'm seeing a plateauing, even if the pace is a little bit slower, assuming it's something environmental like weather and course and things like that, that could be a signal that I've actually reached that same spot as I was before in more optimal conditions. And it is time, if the timeline is appropriate, move on to the next phase of training, which would be that speed work development phase. So this one is a fun time of year for me. I really like the base building phase. It's kind of a part of the sport I like because it's also an intensity that I think is really interesting and important for ultra marathoning. A lot of times I think of kind of like the base intensity or the top end of that top end of zone 2 is sort of like the red line for a lot of the longer ultra marathons, where like if I'm doing a 100-miler or something like that, like the odds of me pushing above my aerobic threshold for any significant amount of time and having that work out well for me is really, really low. So I always get really interested in this because like if I'm going to do a very controlled event like a track ultra marathon and things like that, the pace at which I'm able to run, my base intensity, and then the volume that I'm able to tolerate at that intensity is a very important marker for me. It's one that I'm very interested in improving, and it's what I would almost kind of consider like a similar to like a race pace intensity if I were doing something that were a little shorter, like one of the Olympic distance races, peaking for those like 5Ks, 10Ks, marathons, and things like that. During this phase, I'm also kind of continuing with the strength work and the mobility stuff. That's going to be something that is very consistent year round. I maybe dove a little bit deeper into that phase or that side of things in the last episode. So if you're interested in maybe a little more context around the strength work and mobility, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode, because I'm not going to just necessarily repeat all of that stuff. But I am, generally speaking, working at keeping that in there and targeting probably 2 lower body sessions per week and then 2 upper body core sessions per week that follow some of those lifts that I mentioned in the off-season training. One thing I will start to do though is I'll start to add a little more variance to some of the strength work to this, or add some more options that I would likely stay away from during the off-season. And that would be like a muscular endurance training for strength work, where I have a muscular endurance routine that I like to do that I usually will introduce for the first time in the training cycle during the base building phase. And that will be a kind of 4 movement circuit that I'll do. It's 6 by 10 repetitions. And those movements are 6 by 10 box steps, so 10 reps on each leg on that box step. And then I'll do 6 by 10 jumping squats, 6 by 10 jumping split squats, and then 6 by 10 forward lunges. And that's again each leg. So it's like any strength work program where like you can increase the difficulty of that by shortening the recovery time between those sets, or make it a little bit easier if you're having a hard time. If I'm having a hard time, let's say I haven't done it for a while because I'm coming off the off season, I decide to do it for the first time, and I'm just like trying to avoid a scenario where I paint myself into a corner and I take some quality for my next running workout because I went a little too hard on those. I'll give myself a little bit more of a buffer in terms of a recovery time between those, but usually 60 seconds between those is ample. And if it's something where it's like one leg at a time, then I'm more likely to be able to pivot back and forth between those. There is some progression I will do with this. It's unlikely that I will hit the progression during the base building phase of this, but I can also do things like add a 7th or 8th set to those movements. Or if I do that and then still want more, I can add some weight by like picking up some dumbbells by going like maybe 10% of my body weight or 15% of my body weight with some extra weight through those movements as well. So there are some nice progressions that you can use for that. But usually what I'm thinking about with those type of things is start easy, because you can always add another session of it sooner than you normally would if you go a little lighter than you needed to. When you go a little harder than you need to, that's where you find yourself in a situation where you're stealing from tomorrow or compromising your running workout, or at the very least likely pushing off the next opportunity to do that strength session. So those are the scenarios which sometimes would put me into a position of, instead of being able to do 2 lower body sessions that week, I got to stick to 1 because I overreached in 1. But then my overall volume spent at those strength work movements I'm focusing on is actually lower because I bit off more than I could chew on that first session. In terms of just like how I look at this pivot in training from off season to base from a nutrition standpoint, this will be a part of the year where I will start to kind of look at bringing back a little bit more carbohydrate off of what I did from that prior off season. And some of that is just the relative increase in energy expenditure. I talked about this a little bit on the prior episode, but the off season is my lowest energy output time of year, whereas base building, that starts to ramp back up. And at times, especially if I've got, say, a strength work session and a little bit of a longer base run or something like that, or I've got a long run on the schedule in here, then I might be getting up to some of those higher energy output numbers that I'll have over the course of the year, and I need to meet that with my nutrition. So it also is a part of the year where I am, from an intensity standpoint, I have more of everything, including that. So I do end up bringing my carbohydrate up a little bit higher than I do during the base. So I kind of exit like anything that would resemble on paper looking like a strict ketogenic diet to something that I would put more kind of comfortably into like a lower carbohydrate input from a nutritional standpoint. And that also does allow me to introduce a few more food options that I was maybe avoiding during the prior training block due to their carbohydrate concentration. So from the list of stuff, I do add some stuff. Some of this will be repetition if you listen to the first episode, but some of the inputs that are pretty common for me, again, not an exhaustive list, but things that show up on my grocery list over the last 13 years often enough that I felt like I'd put them on the list for this episode, include coconut oil, olive oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, butter or ghee, lard or tallow, full fat salad dressings, fatty cuts of beef, pork, and lamb, chicken, turkey, preferably with the skin, fatty fish like salmon, whole eggs, bacon and sausages, organ meats like liver, full fat cheeses like cheddar, brie, mozzarella, heavy cream, sour cream, full fat yogurts, kefir, which is a fermented yogurt, milk, usually it's a 2% milk or something like that, cream cheese, coconut milk, the condensed version with the unsweetened stuff that you use for like making a curry, almonds, macadamia nuts, pecans, walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds, hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds, leafy greens like spinach, kale, and Swiss chard, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, zucchini, cucumbers, asparagus, avocado, eggplants, bell peppers, berries like strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries, potatoes of all kinds, beets, honey, apples, melons of all kinds, sourdough bread, and coffee. So as you probably noticed, especially near the end of that list, those started to bring back some of those more like carbohydrate specific options that I'm going to have a little bit more of during this phase of training than I am during my off season.